Thank you, everybody, so much for coming in this evening and joining us for session 5 of 10 questions. Tonight's question is, everybody remembers, what is memory? And whatever else it is, and whatever the things we learn from the conversation that we'll all have together this evening, one thing memory is this remarkable human capacity, this idea of our comprehension of what isn't with us, who isn't with us in a room. And I say that tonight because it's with absence, in fact, that we begin this evening's session. We originally had 4 speakers scheduled for this evening, as we do every Tuesday evening. And like each session, those 4 guests will have a conversation around tonight's question. Sadly, World Arts and Cultures professor Polly Nutter-Roberts, listed for tonight's session, passed away in September. A brilliant scholar, a beloved teacher, a colleague, a wife, a mother, Polly brightened so many of our lives with her brilliant mind, luminous spirit, unyielding optimism, and boundless generosity that we will all remember her tonight of all nights here within the school. Polly shared these thoughts about the role of memory in her own wonderful research undertaken as a faculty member in World Arts Cultures Dance here in the School of Arts and Architecture. Polly wrote this way regarding memory. One of the deep subjects of my work is memory and how memories are transformed into histories. But really what memory is, and its transformation into a historical account, comes down to this: the telling of a story. It's the narration of a story from a particular person's point of view at a specific moment in time in front of a certain audience. That is what becomes history. And another person reciting another story in another place is telling history too, but it may be a completely different history because it is a different person with a different perspective on the past. In the end, memory is always a performance. This evening, we continue to remember Polly. We hold her absence close to us throughout this conversation and every day here within the school. We write her into our story this evening and dedicate this evening's discussion to her memory. And with that, let me introduce this evening's guests. Let me invite them up to the stage now. Dr. Darnell Hunt is director of UCLA's Ralph J. Bunche Center for African American Studies. He's the author of the Hollywood Diversity Report and professor of sociology. His research interests include race, media, and cultural studies. Dr. Kelsey Martin is a neuroscientist and Dean of the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. Dr. Martin is a professor of biological chemistry and of psychiatry and biobehavioral sciences, and has been a leader in UCLA's drive to promote cross-disciplinary cooperation among scientists in neuroscience and other brain-related research. And finally, distinguished Professor Peter Sellars from our own department of World Arts, Cultures, Dance, is an opera, theater, and festival director who has gained renown worldwide for his groundbreaking and transformative interpretations of artistic masterpieces and collaborative projects with an extraordinary range of creative artists. He's known for exploring challenging moral issues such as race, war, poverty, and the international refugee crisis through his work. And as we have done in previous sessions, we're going to invite each of our guests to make a brief presentation, and from that, enjoy an evening's conversation around tonight's question, what is memory? And we have an agreed order, and we will begin this evening with Kelsey Martin.
Way. My whole research program is around how are memories stored in the brain. And so why do we think about the brain? It's because we know from many studies in humans that when there are lesions in the brain, for example, in a part of the brain called the hippocampus, because it's called the hippocampus because it looks a little like a seahorse, when there's a stroke there, when there's some kind of an injury, the person with that injury can no longer form long-term memories. So their experiences are never actually encoded into a long-term memory. And similarly, other parts of the brain, when there are lesions there, there are alterations in the way that that individual will perceive the world, will behave, will encode information, and will in turn transform that information into memories. And those memories are thus stored in the brain, and we really want to understand how it is that how our everyday experience is encoded in memories in the brain. So the human brain is shown here. It's a 3-pound organ in our head. And about, well over 100 years ago, Ramon y Cajal, who was a Spanish neuroscientist, literally sitting at his kitchen table with a microscope, using this beautiful staining method where you could see individual nerve cells in the brain. This was from a pigeon brain. He saw this, and he realized from looking at it that there were all these different cells, that it wasn't a whole gamish. At the time, it was thought to be a syncytium. And he looked at it, and he saw, here's one cell that has this incredible, elaborate arbor of processes. And he saw that they contacted each other at specific sites. And just by looking at that structure of the brain, he came up with the idea that those connections between nerve cells might be the site where memories are stored. So this was not any kind of molecular biology, no genetics. It was really by looking at the form that the nerve cells existed in the brain. So that's well over 100 years, and we now know that he was right, that there's something that we call synaptic plasticity. Those sites of contact, they're called synapses for the Greek clasping together, that those sites, those synaptic connections change with our experience. And in fact, while you're sitting here, if you remember anything at the end of this evening, you will have a different structure in your brain. Those nerve cells will be forming different synapses. You will have gained some new synapses. And we have a lot of, really, to me, beautiful, empowering tools for starting to understand how that process works. That was over 100 years ago. Now we can use tools using genetics and molecular biology where we can label nerve cells using a lot of different fluorescent proteins. This is in the part of a brain called the cerebellum in the back of your head and back of your brain that's involved in coordination, in motor skills, motor learning. These are beautiful cerebellar Purkinje neurons that form these arbors, and here you can label individual neurons with different fluorescent proteins so you can see what their structure is and how they contact one another. Here's a nerve cell that's in your cortex, the part of your brain that's required for what we call executive function, making sure that you behave professionally. We can label in the whole neuron in red, but we can label the individual synapses, those places where nerve cells communicate with one another and where there's that plasticity where memories can be stored with that green label. And so over time, one can look at those individual cells. You can do something where you can use genetics to label multiple cells in what's called the neural circuit. And why is this important? It's because the human brain has about 100 billion neurons, and it has about 100 trillion synapses. It's this incredibly complex circuit that is the circuitry that underlies our perception, our emotions, our ability to remember, the way we behave, the way we move, and all of that changes over time. It's hardwired when we're born, but it undergoes this dynamic remodeling. And so, the way that I think about memory is how does that dynamic remodeling happen? We can even take nerve cells, for example, at a very high power microscope, looking at it, stimulating it, and you can watch over time that these new sites of contacts, these new synapses will grow. So that kind of plasticity is something that we can now begin to really understand. What are the underlying molecular mechanisms? And by understanding that, the hope is really that we'll be able to address diseases that involve memory, whether those are things like post-traumatic stress disorder or things like Alzheimer's disease, where there's a loss of memory. And the other thing that studies like this they've revealed over a history of work from many different people across the globe are three principles that I think are really important for us as human beings. One of them is that there's something called a critical period in childhood, and it's really the period up through adolescence at which that kind of synaptic plasticity is particularly powerful. And so our early childhood experiences are stored in changes in the connectivity of deep brain structures in what's called the limbic system that very powerfully alters the way that we see the world. And hence, children who have traumatic experiences will carry that with them, and then their subsequent experiences will be altered by that. Another feature is that emotion has a powerful impact on that synaptic plasticity. So I'm going to age myself here, but if you remember, and I was really young at the time, but when I remember when JFK was killed, and I remember my mom crying, and I remember that situation quite well. I really remember when Princess Di died, because it was there was a lot of emotion, and that emotion tends to really enhance plasticity and memory formation. So there's a lot of work on what's the role of emotion and attention and alertness in forming memories. Another important feature of memory is repetition. And I think any student knows this. There's lots of work that shows that if you want to learn how to play the piano and you practice once a week for 2 hours, that's not as good as practicing every day for half an hour. So that kind of repetition is a way that that our brains are able to promote that plasticity and that storage of memory. So these are, I think of myself as somewhat of what I call a reductionist. I think of what's the real, the concrete storage, what we call the engram of memory in the brain. And yet I recognize that this doesn't necessarily capture what our own individual experiences of memory are, and yet it does tell me something very important about my own experience of memory, which is that it's dynamic, that all of my past experiences are changing the way that I'm perceiving any ongoing experience, and that in turn means that memory can be quite fallible and subjective. It's not a recording of reality. It's an act somewhere between recording and sort of creativity that comes with your entire past experience as a human being. And so I think that understanding of the biology and understanding how the biology explains that dynamic, subjective, emotional component of memory holds a lot of promise for understanding many aspects of human experience and of psychiatric disease.
Cheers, thank you. Kelsey, thank you. Everyone, Darnell Hunt.
All right. Okay, in many ways, I'm going to pick up where Kelsey left off. She was talking about a very concrete way of thinking about memory. I'm going to talk about ways in which the social interacts with the biological, ways in which what happens to us in our lives and our experiences affect the way the brain remembers. In social science, we have a number of different ways of talking about memory conventionally. We talk about sensory memory, which really allows us to retain snippets of information from second to second. For example, seeing a frame of a film and seeing that over time. It looks like fluid motion because we can remember those individual images. Or short-term memory, which allows us to kind of understand the meaning of a sentence because we remember the first part of the sentence to the end of the sentence. And then we have something we call long-term memory, which really gets to our connections with a particular point in time or a place. We tend to remember those things over longer periods of time, particularly when we're exposed to those same conditions over again. That's a conventional way of thinking about memory within the social sciences, which picks up a lot of its insight from the biological sciences. Today, though, I'm going to talk more about the intertextual and meaning making. And take a second to read this quote here. It actually connects very well with something that Brett mentioned at the very beginning about Pauli and her work. Why don't you take a second to read this, and then we'll continue. The basic idea here is that as human beings, storytelling is hardwired into who we are. We connect with other people, we communicate by telling stories, and often those stories involve our memories. Today I want to talk about something called the circuit of culture, which in a second you'll see how this relates to the idea of what I call intertextual memories. And here we have a circuit of 5 important moments, starting with representation. And by representation, I mean the irresistible images, ideas, utterances that shape the way we think about the world. And examples of representations might be things like race, a concept that defines people to certain categories. In sociology, we talk about it as a socially constructed concept, or gender. Or any number of other concepts that are used to put people into categories to help us make sense of what would otherwise be a chaotic world. The insight of this particular diagram is that representation is connected to all of these other things like identity, who we are, who we aren't, who we hope to be, production, the types of things we produce in society, the way we produce them as a reflection of who we think we are or of the representations that order our society. The things we consume, advertising, obviously, and I think Kelsey was sort of referencing this a few minutes ago in terms of repetition and remembering things. One of the core, practices within advertising is to repeatedly give the same message over and over again to compel people to remember the product and to hopefully consume it over time. And then regulation. How we draw boundaries between different groups, who's inside, who's outside. All of these things are bound up with the concept of representation. They affect who we are in terms of our identity, what we as a culture produce, and what we consume. Now, I want to move forward to what I call the media experience. And here, of course, representation becomes a very important part of what happens when we experience media text, movies, television, etc. Representations like race, like gender, inform the intertextual memories that we bring to the media experience. When we watch something on television, we don't watch it cold, we're always watching it in relation to other things we've seen in the past. These media texts both shape and are shaped by representations. That is to say, people who create media text are trafficking in the representations that circulate in society. Those media texts become part of the fluid reservoir of memories that circulate as people engage with them. This is kind of happening at the macro level in society, kind of at the level above the individual, the level of collectivities. If we move more to the micro level and what's happening with individuals like you and me, like those of us sitting in this room, we are decoding what we're seeing and hearing on television. And often that decoding is a product largely of the memories we bring to that situation. We may have encountered things like this in the past, which cause us to interpret it in a particular way. At the same time, as individuals, we exist in society. We're not isolated. That is to say, we interact with other people. So there's always decoding in a social context, often in the networks in which we are embedded in society, our friends, our family, etc. Often our discussions with them, their interpretations of what we saw, inflect the way we interpret it. This goes to what we call negotiated decoding, where we kind of negotiate the meaning of a particular encounter on the basis of our own individual predispositions filtered through the lens of our interactions with important others. And as you can see, this flows back into our intertextual memories. The cycle repeats itself. There really is no start or end. This is an ongoing cycle. All right, this is a theoretical model that's influenced by something known as British cultural studies, which was an intellectual tradition that arose in the 1970s, largely as a correction to, at the time, overly deterministic ways of sort of conceptualizing the relationship between meaning-making and messages. There was a belief at one point in time in the magic bullet theory that if you send a message, it will, like a magic bullet, enter into our brains and lead to a particular type of meaning. And that was the orthodoxy for a long time. Eventually, however, empirical studies started to show that it doesn't quite work that way. People are amazingly creative at challenging sort of the mainstream or dominant view of a particular message. And so the question became, how do we measure this? How do we understand this empirically? And so this model is meant to try to do this. The thing I want to emphasize today, of course, is that intertextual memories, the memories of all the other encounters we have in our lives with media, with messages, with other people, are an integral part of the process. So to kind of work through this idea really quickly, I want to take the case of the 1992 Los Angeles Uprisings, something I've written about in the past. In fact, I think you reviewed a chapter from a book I wrote on this. So one way of thinking about the 1992 uprisings, particularly memories of the 1992 uprisings, is by looking at the way those events were depicted on television. For those who weren't around in 1992, the 1992 uprisings at the time were described by the LA Times as the worst riots of the century. There was over $1 billion worth of damage in Los Angeles. There were 52 people who were killed. There were thousands arrested. The event came on the heels of not guilty verdicts in the Rodney King beating case. He was a black motorist who was pulled over by police, and just so happened that a passerby had a camcorder and recorded the whole thing. The video was taken to a local news station, and it went viral. All right? The thing I want to emphasize here, and we can talk more about this in our discussion, is that I screened for 15 groups of viewers on the basis of their race and their class, the exact same 17-minute news clip. And part of what I wanted to understand was, how are people making sense of this news clip based on their positioning in society? One of the things I expected, and one of the things I found, was that as they talked about the event in their groups, intertextual memories of other similar events, of movies they had seen, television shows, speeches they had heard, shaped the way they were processing the information. And there was interesting patterning along racial lines in terms of how those interpretations played out. So in closing, and we can continue this a little bit in a few minutes, I'll share with you some of the quotes from the groups. The way we see things is affected by what we know or believe. This is an important idea that was put forward in the early 1970s as part of this tradition from a book called Ways of Seeing that talked about the subjective nature of the way we experience the social worlds around us, that it's not purely an objective process that can be measured uniformly across all viewers, all observers. In fact, observers bring different materials to those encounters, and one of the important things they bring is intertextual memory. Thank you.
Thank you, Darnell. Everybody, Darnell Hunt. And our final presentation, Peter Sellars.
You know what? You should make this hot, right? Hello, heat. Yes. So turn it on. Let's do the roll. Shall we be hot now? Let's be hot. Okay. Thank you deeply. My goodness. I am going to try and go through some of the same material, but by a very circuitous route. And forgive me, but part of my training as an artist is that the shortest distance between 2 points means you didn't learn anything. And so for me, the long way around is actually how life works. And what's not immediately adjacent turns out to be, in fact, incredibly close. And that question where near becomes far and far becomes near is one of the main points of memory. And I would like to pick up on several things that, first of all, I want to thank Brett for making these evenings. I'm just so happy to meet these two people that I would not have known. I've been teaching at UCLA for 30 years. Hello. Finally, I'm meeting you tonight. Thank you. So thank you very much. Just to say, for me, the moral questions of memory are really profound. And I want to deal with what we remember and what we actually deny, what we hold and cherish, and what we can't deal with and how we don't deal with it, and how memory operates as an ethical system, and what memory actually has to be with the way you decide to live your life, which is 2 words that are very important to me as a performer and somebody who organizes performance: remember and repentance. What we do in performance is we take the voices of those who are no longer here and we give them new bodies, our own. And we invite other people to speak through us. We create a spirit possession. We create a moment in which our identity is suddenly blurred with another identity. And what I want to just mention tonight is a performance that I've just come from putting on in Madrid. It's still running for the next 2 weeks, anyone who's going to Madrid, of 2 Japanese no plays, 14th century Zen Buddhist plays. And we've titled the evening one of the lines from one of the plays, which is, "Only the sound remains." What it means when you lose someone, but you're remembering them all day, all night, and you're still in conversation with them. Their physical presence is gone, but their voice is with you. And only the sound remains. And the way in which sound carries memory, the way in which a piece of music carries memory, the way in which our soundtrack all day long is actually the way we're ordering our memories. And sound, exactly because of its fluidity and because its non-material nature, the way it eludes any attempt at organizing it, the way voices flow through your consciousness, who you still keep thinking of, and how that operates, of course, in spiritual path, because Jesus and Buddha and Muhammad are not here, but their voice remains with us. And then what it means to remember, that is to say, Jesus is asking you to embody his words. And you have to offer your body to those voices and that speech. And walk in somebody else's footsteps. And actually begin to acknowledge that you're not alone and you're not, in fact, yourself. But all these voices are moving through you and inspiring your actions and inspiring your next moves, which is what brings me to the word repentance, which is things we've all done that we're not proud of, and we feel we have to live our lives to make up for that and to somehow make that good. And what it means that you have certain memories that are very difficult. And you have to live in a way that brings some equilibrium, some balance, and some justice. And the way justice operates in memory, where we know something that unjust has happened. And we live with that memory of injustice. And what it means to live every day as a way to counteract those memories and correct them. Or, the same way, moments of deep beauty in our life that we're searching for to enhance and to allow them to flower. And so I'm going to just mention briefly, oh God, the Buddhist sense of store consciousness, just to get at these Zen plays. And store consciousness is understanding that every single gesture you make and every thought you have and everything you say becomes a seed in your consciousness. And your consciousness is all of those seeds planted across many, many lifetimes. And your life is which seeds you choose to water and pay attention to, or which seeds you actually recognize as weeds and try to pull out by the roots. And what the garden of your life is based on how you order your memories, which memories are the place from which you want to grow, what is the tree that the seed of a certain action results in across your whole lifetime. You make one action at one moment in your life, and it becomes a tree across your whole life. That seed. And to take something you spoke of so movingly, which is that memories are not frozen. It's quite the opposite. They're alive. And just to say, if I ask everybody in the room tonight to just have a memory, an image, take a snapshot of your mother and hold that image in front of you. Now, tonight. And you will pick an image from a moment, a powerful moment between the two of you. And you can see your mother. But as you hold that image now in your mind, you see things you didn't see at the time when you took that snapshot. Because you know more about your mother now than you did when that snapshot occurred. And you know a little more about the context of what was going on than you knew then. So what happens is not only did that memory not remain stable, but you're adding to that memory new information and new ways of understanding and new perspectives, which you showed so beautifully in that graph. And what it means that every single instant in your life is continuing to grow with you. And so not only does memory not remain in the past, but memory is no moment remains its own separate self, but actually is transforming and continues to grow. Every second in your life continues to be active for the rest of your life. So the way we demonstrate that in theater is to actually step into other bodies and to move through images that allow us to deal with memory. And I would just say, to quote Toni Morrison, I think one of the most powerful images is ghosts, is recognizing that we're all haunted by ghosts. There are ghosts that are part of all of our lives. And in the arts, the ghost is frequently a powerful way that you can actually give form to a memory that is otherwise extremely elusive. Japanese no theater, invented in basically the 1300s, at a high moment of Zen culture, has the plays all have the same structure. A wandering priest goes through a certain landscape, and the first part of the play is a very specific tracing of a geography, of a journey. Real place names, what the temperature is, what the water is like there, what the sky was, what the weather was. All this detail of tracing a journey and trying to retrace a footstep. And then the priest arrives at a place where he decides, I'd like to stay here. Sits down, sees someone raking leaves. Asks the person who's raking leaves, what happened in this place? That's part one of the play. Part two of the play is the spirit of the person raking leaves returns, but now as a spirit in a whole new costume and mask, and dances out that she was a warrior who dressed in armor, people didn't know who she was, and she was killed at this spot, and the person who killed her was her husband. And that was 700 years ago. And that is the person raking leaves here today, because the spirit is trapped here in this place forever. And then the spirit disappears. And the quality of understanding that not only do human beings have a memory, but places have memories. And that trauma or moments of exceptional beauty in a place live on through the people who live in that place. And that trauma is not over with at one historical moment, but actually across centuries, that trauma repeats itself and affects people in a certain place. And also moments of beauty and moments of truth. So the play that I'm dealing with is called Tsunemasa in Japanese. And it's a priest who makes a ceremony for a young man who died in battle, because this young man killed someone and then was killed. And the young man, I think, is the priest's lover. But in Asia, in many Buddhist cultures, there's a formal practice of when somebody leaves the world in pain, when someone leaves the world in terrible circumstances, you make a ceremony for their spirit 1 year after their death and 3 years after their death, because nobody wants angry spirits and hurt spirits wandering around, because it's terrible for everyone. And you create a ceremony to call back the spirit of the person who's gone and say, you died horribly and we know that. And we have to acknowledge your sadness. We have to acknowledge the injustice. We have to acknowledge all the things that were not acknowledged in your lifetime. And we have to let you know we remember you, and we want to make good what was very bad. We want to make just what was unjust. We want to offer you the compassion and love you did not feel then. And we're going to create a ceremony. And of course, the beginning of theater, the invention of the performing arts, in most cultures is performing for the dead. Is actually the reason we perform is to tell the dead we remember them, to ask them to remember us kindly, better than we deserve to be remembered, ask them to favor us, and to somehow put back into balance something that is deeply out of balance. And we can't live another day with the memory of what was wrong. This play begins, is that ceremony, and the spirit of this deeply damaged young man comes back. And it's a harrowing middle of the night. And finally, the young man has to return back into another world because the spirits can't make it through the Earth's atmosphere. Only the voices can make it through. And if I could quote the Ezra Pound translation, I perceive no form but a voice. And the spirit says, it is the faint sound alone that remains. The priest says, but I saw the form really. The spirit says, it is there if you see it. The priest says, I can see. The spirit says, are you sure you see it really? The priest says, oh, do I or do I not see you? The chorus takes over for this ghost's voice. Changeful Sunimasa, full of the universal unstillness, looked back upon the world. His voice was heard there, a voice without form. None might see him, but he looked out from his phantom world, a dream that gazed on our world. The priest says, it is strange. The figure was there and is gone. Only the thin sound remains. The film of a dream, perhaps. And then the spirit returns to the other world. And these lines by the great Japanese poet Zeami conclude the play. And I don't mean to emphasize what's negative, but I tend to feel that most people live with so many regrets, so many things that deeply, deeply at the core of your being you're trying to compensate for. And again, I just can't thank you enough for bringing up the LA Uprising and for what it means when something that was never, ever even acknowledged correctly is then further misremembered. But in fact, it's a moment of sorrow. It's a moment of deep sorrow that makes a deep impression on us. These are the last words of the play, which, by the way, is 3.5 pages long. And the performance takes 90 minutes or 2 hours. So the material is just, you live inside this material the same way you live inside your memory, that something took a second in real life, and you spend weeks arguing with that person once they're gone. And going back over that conversation, said, what did they mean when they said this? And they said, no, but they misheard me. And you replay everything for weeks and months and years that in real life took seconds. That's the way the Japanese invented this form of theater. What it means that something that happened for a second in your life has this endless existence and goes into infinite time and space. The sorrow of the heart is a spreading around of quick fires. Think of your beautiful arbors. The sorrow of the heart is a spreading around of quick fires. The flames are turned to thick rain. The sorrow of the heart is a spreading around of quick fires. The flames are turned into rain. He slew by the sword and was slain. The red wave of blood rose in fire, and now he burns with that flame. He bade us put out the light. Oh, the last word of the Spirit was, it's a sorry face that I make here. Put down the lights if you see me. He bade us put out the lights. He flew as a summer moth. His brushing wings were a storm. His spirit is gone in the darkness. So we're talking about living with the sound of those brushing wings in the dark.
Thank you. Peter, Kelsey, Darnell, thank you each for those presentations. I think as we did last week, let's take 2 minutes to take a deep breath, stand up, shake yourself out if you'd like, lean over to the neighbor that you're sitting next to or someone behind you, share a thought with them.
Thank you, it's so moving.
Ask a question, hear their response. We're going to do the same up here, and we'll come back online in about 2 minutes. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. After those three terrific presentations, what I've just suggested to our three guests this evening is to maybe open the conversation up between the three of them, having now seen the presentations by your fellow guests this evening, and I'm going to turn it over to the three of you for a minute.
Well, there's one thing that I, listening to my colleagues talk that I was thinking about, and I'd like to hear your thoughts about, and it has to do with, we've been talking about remembering, but part of remembering is forgetting. And what does that mean to forget? And I know from biology of memory studies that we don't really forget, that we think we forget. Mm-hmm. But there are these memories that are present that will come out and that we're not even aware of, but that there's something called inhibition that gets placed on top of those memories, and then in a certain situation that might come away and it's actually there. But so I'd like to just talk for a moment about forgetting and what that means.
Well, that's an interesting question. So when I was conducting the study that I referred to briefly a few moments ago, one of the things I was trying to explore was sort of how, when people get together in a group, they collectively negotiate the meaning of something. And one of the theories called informational influence is that when you're in a group and there's kind of a dominant understanding of something, the question is, what happens when the group discusses it? Well, there's something called, group polarization, where the view can even become more dominant over time as people are reinforcing one another's understandings. And one of the arguments for how that happens is something called informational influence theory, that people who come to the group with a predisposition towards seeing something in a certain way may have forgotten some of the arguments that support that position, but when they get around people like themselves and they hear that information again, they're like, aha, that's right, and they actually harden their adherence to that point of view. So this is something that I actually found in all the groups I studied. Most of the groups, if you sort of did this quasi-experimental thing where you measured kind of where they were on a scale when they first came to the meeting, by the end they were way over here. And this was true in every group, and the scales would go in different directions depending upon the basic understanding of the group. And so forgetting was a big part of that, and then remembering once it was brought up in group conversation.
one of the ethical issues for me so much right now in America right now is this, in order to create the mythical golden age that a bunch of people keep wanting to create, that's only possible if you forget a whole lot of stuff. And that forgetting is highly organized. And you decide what things are inconvenient, and they are just erased while you create out of memory something super evil called nostalgia, in which something was never true. But your damn sugarcoating and golden glow and extra maple syrup create something where the original taste is actually gone, and something has morphed into a wish fulfillment of something that supports your own sense of superiority.
Yeah.
And you can say, I'm on top of this. Yeah. And I know when there was a good time, and this isn't it. And conveniently choose to not include not only what was happening to other people then, but what you were actually doing. Yeah. And what the implications of that are. And so for me, that total constructed forgetting is a pretty intense thing, and we're seeing it all over the world right now. And we're seeing it as a nightmare epidemic.
Yeah. I think this is one of the reasons why we see different groups bringing different memories to these encounters, because the experiences are different. And someone may experience something as the good old times or great in many ways, and they can do this because they are relatively privileged in that particular moment. And other people, of course, wouldn't see it that way, so they would bring other memories to the encounter. And so we see a lot of this in the study I did with 1992. I mean, the whole question of whether or not it was a quote-unquote riot versus a rebellion, differed very sharply depending upon those backgrounds and the experiences that people brought in. A lot of the black informants in the study, saw this as a chance for the voiceless to be heard in ways that they couldn't be heard before. Other groups, of course, brought in memories that sparked fears of various sorts, and this was to be avoided. It was definitely a riot, which if you look at the definition of riot, it's senseless. It doesn't really have any basis in terms of moving us in a positive direction. And so there were very different takes on this based on the memories that people brought to bear. And I think that, for me at least, it fits very nicely with the way you're kind of articulating this whole idea of nostalgia and differential, I guess, value that groups place on the past, on different parts of the past.
Again, I was just so moved by these diagrams.
Micrographs, not diagrams. It's real biology there. It's like, I think of graphs as like something that somebody drew or made up. These are like, this is what's in your brain.
At a moment in time, I mean, one of the points that you brought to immediately is the idea of if memory is anything, it's a fundamentally dynamic.
Changing all the time, always changing. And I even, when you talked about the play of, of a woman remembering 700 years ago, and I can't help it, I really do feel like a total scientific geek, but I think about the fact that there are these things called epigenetic marks that go from generation to generation that actually change the way that your DNA is marked by your past ancestry and your past experiences. It's going to change the way that whole circuitry works. So, and of course I'm saying that as, as if, okay, so, I recognize that as a scientist, we're also making up stories about what we see. I showed you that picture of those neurons that Ramon y Cajal looked at over 100 years ago. He made up a story about what was going on there. Another person saw it and made a different story. It turns out that he was Ramona Cajal was right about the story that he made. So it's this kind of interplay between what we think is real biology, what we know in the story we're telling ourselves about it. But
it's the social and the biological.
Yeah, and it's sort of a metaphor of how, like, you know, for me, it's I listen to that and I go, oh, that's epigenetics, that transgenerational long history that we have as human beings. But
I was struck also by the three brilliant perspectives at which you approach the question, the degree to which your own creative and professional fields are themselves kinds of memory structures for the holding of ideas. Ideas about memory in this case, but your 100-year quick summary of brain sciences, your field is also the repository of those ideas.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's one of the things I really love about science is that it all builds upon discoveries that others make, right? It's always building upon a discovery or an enabling technology or something, you learn something. Sometimes it's wrong and you have to learn, oh, that was wrong, and you have to go another direction. So you can go down the wrong pathway if you think that things are written in stone in a textbook, but it does build on, you know, it's Newton's, you stand on the shoulders of giants and you see further because of that. And to me, that's a pretty remarkable
the Japanese
adventure.
No version of that is that this year's flowers come from last year's seeds.
It's beautiful.
And that it's this completely ongoing thing, and it's a continuous transition. And it doesn't end. And that more deeply you look into, again, if you're looking for your great-grandmother, look into the eyes of your granddaughter. That's really what we're seeing, is this deep continuity. And this sense that something is not just evolving, but it actually is reaching in very profound ways across generations. And I think just living with thoughts that are not your own in the same way your eyes are also not your own, and your ears are your grandfather, and you know, you're actually carrying around with you a lot of stuff that's not just you. And that is extremely powerful.
There's a pretty prominent theater, film, and television professor here at UCLA years ago that influenced my thinking about the way people engage with media. His name was Tashomi Gabriel.
Oh my God, you're kidding.
I'm not kidding.
Tashomi is the greatest.
Yeah.
Oh, excuse me, may we have a memorial service for Tashomi tonight?
That's right.
Thank you, Tashomi Gabriel. Oh my goodness, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, he introduced me to British cultural studies, actually, as I was trying to get my hands around this whole idea of meaning construction. I'm trying to find a quote from him, actually, that I remember the gist of it, but I want to get it right. He basically said that, let me see, where is it? It's all out of order here. Okay. Here we go. He said, so he was interested in basically the conditions confronted by marginalized groups in society, and the ways in which those conditions lead to the creation of what he called a collective memory. And it kind of goes to the point you were making about the memories that we carry with us that linger for years. And these memories can often deviate from the official history, that certain groups that are in control, who are able to kind of encode certain understandings of the past. And he said, this memory, quote, decisively frames the production and reception of commercial culture for these groups, and despite dominant efforts to privilege certain meanings, the meanings associated with society are never completely sutured. And so his argument was that, we are always, because of the experiences we encounter in the groups to which we belong, particularly marginalized groups, able to overcome those dominant messages by the memories we bring to the encounters. And that's kind of what I was trying to explore with the LA Uprisings, in the way different groups were interpreting the same official news text of that evening.
and what it means when we move through different geographies, which, of course, shape our entire way we are living in our body. And one of the deepest things that Tashomi was able to demonstrate over and over again in his third cinema is this idea that as people are moving across different phases of their lives, if you've had to reinvent yourself 4 times in order to be where you are now, the way you read everyone else's story is different. Because you've actually had to tell a lot of different stories. And your story has not been allowed to be the same. Because in America, for example, with immigration and refugees, we only allow 3 stories to be told. And if you tell one of those 3 stories, you have a chance of getting in. And so people have to actually falsify their experience at the immigration interview, because whatever actually happened to you is not on the list. And so that, and Tashomi's, brilliance is that how many ways people have learned to tell their story and have learned to remember things that have been deliberately erased, erased by the culture that's surrounding them. And how do you keep those things alive? Not only in memory, but then translate your memory into practice. And that's a really powerful thing that we're living with right now.
Definitely.
I think we're going to open the conversation up to the entire room, as we've done before. I think we have some microphones out and about, and over here on this side, we see.
So you sort of answered my question a little bit in that last discussion. But I was curious about, we live in a time where information is mass-produced and mitigated on an unprecedented scale through social media and the internet. And so in some ways we have so much more access to different kinds of collective memory or personal memory. But I feel like that mitigation also impacts what we were discussing about the culture circuit and intertextual memory. And so how do we facilitate more of those conversations where people come together and they bring their different interpretations of events, and instead of being polarized or hardened into their former belief, they are, that plasticity is encouraged. And I guess I was just wondering what all of your perspectives on that are.
Well, maybe I'll take the first stab at that. That's a great question. So I think, one of the reasons why, when I was asked to do this, that I picked this particular example is because, it's an old example. It comes from 25 years ago. But for me, it really speaks to the present moment in terms of the siloization of our culture in many ways, the ways in which many groups are living in these echo chambers where they're only hearing ideas and thoughts that reinforce their predispositions. And there aren't as many opportunities for us to kind of come together, or rather technology has allowed us to avoid having to come together. I guess that's the better way to put it. There are opportunities to come together, but it's easier not to do that. And I think it leads to the type of polarization we see. We see it in small groups, and that's what I was able to show in the study I did, that this whole phenomenon of small group polarization based on all these mechanisms that we talked about, like selectively forgetting and then remembering, and oh, that's right, well now I'm going to be even more staunch in this particular idea. So I don't know, I think it really is about finding ways to make our communities more inclusive and bringing more people into the tent and having conversations that cross the boundaries that social media has allowed us to erect in very regular and patterned ways.
Thank you.
So I would, there are a couple ways I think about this, and part of the way I'm framing it is, again, to come back to my discipline in a way, which is that, 2 things. One is I think, I'm aware that fear really changes the way we process information, has an incredibly profound way, impact on how we perceive things and how we remember things. And so I think that there's a need to really be very cognizant of how much fear is driving the information that's coming in. And then the other part is that I think there's a real need to recognize when I was talking about how early childhood experience, there's this critical period for shaping the brain. There are really profound studies that show, for example, that learning languages when you're very young, in the first year of life, you're not learning the language, but you're hearing, for example, a language that has different tones. If you don't hear that in your first year of life, you can't even hear those distinctions later in your life. So it really shapes the way you perceive the world. And I think that there's a reality to that, that our, to recognize that our brains have been wired in a way that we see things through the lens of the people we've been around. That to me is a little bit liberating, in the sense that if that were recognized, there might be more of a openness to saying, oh, I'm seeing things incredibly subjectively, and to go back to, you were talking about Zen traditions, there's this tradition of Zen mind, beginner's mind, which there's no real, if your mind is always being changed by experience, there's no real beginner's mind, but you can at least try to get towards that, where you recognize that your experience are really shaping how you perceive the world.
Just to go one step, next step, which is, of course, that emptiness, that beginner's mind, that understanding that everything is empty, actually, and emptying it of all the associations, all the meanings, and really beginning to try and find the place at which things are empty is a very, very, very powerful thing to do. And a simple thing, for example, just working in theater, is for me, whenever I'm putting something on stage, I have to make sure the actor is playing the opposite. In Japanese no drama, it says if you're going to be a very angry person on stage, you have to be very quiet and very balanced and very self-possessed. It would be incorrect to show an angry person out of control. You always have to put a little of the opposite to make sure the truth is there. And that's one of the things as art, we're always dealing with the difference between art and propaganda. Propaganda is trying to convince you of something, and therefore it's telling one side of the story. So what we always have to do on stage is the shy person. If you have an actor act like a little mouse, it's ridiculous. The shy person is probably the loudest person in the room. And so you always make a dramatic choice that's the opposite of the obvious choice. And you make sure that you're balancing everything with its opposite, because everything has to contain its opposite to be true. And that begins to create some sense of balance, some sense of equilibrium. And for the actor, it gives him something, or her, something to play against that actually creates a depth and creates a complexity of emotional experience. And you're never doing a one-for-one obvious correlation, but you make everybody have to go through the opposite of what it is they're supposedly expressing. And that creates something like the complexity of human consciousness.
All the way up on the right side there, I see a hand up.
I'm wondering if certain issues that we're facing in terms of memory and attention are helping to increase our sense of tribalism and also our sense of, how would I say this, very easily instigated outrage. For instance, some of my professors, when I was here as a student in the English Lit department, spoke of people reciting Homer's entire works from memory. And when I was growing up, pre-digital age, I had 100 phone numbers in my head. Now I can barely remember my own phone number to give out to people. So also, there's a lot of issues with attention. I think there's a lot of, correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of neurobiological studies are out right now that attention is rapidly changing. People's attention spans are quite shorter. I'm wondering if these two issues, memory, which we're relying on our devices for all the time. Why remember anything when you can look it up? And also diminished attention are contributing to these other issues we're talking about.
Well, I do, I would agree with that, and I think that part of the issue is that those technologies are evolving a lot more quickly than our brains are evolving, and I think that a couple things. It's important to realize that our brain, when we perceive things, we actually are making up half of what we see. If you figure out what is coming into your retina and what you're looking at, we're making up half of it. But there's so much stuff coming in right now that I do think it is, maybe there just isn't the time to really put everything together in a way that is very thoughtful. I remember my daughter in high school took a poetry class, and the English teacher, when I asked him, well, why are you having a whole semester just on poetry? I was delighted, but he was very explicit about it, and he said it's because it's so important if you're 15, 16 years old to have to take time to read a poem, really read a poem carefully and spend your time reading the poem. And it made me realize how rarely that happens, right? I grew up with that, but I certainly feel that my children, my students, they don't have as much time. And at the medical school, I can tell you that as a physician, you are now, when you see a patient, you look at the patient and you talk to the patient, but you are with a monitor that tells you their entire medical history and all, in some cases, their entire imaging, data, their lab data, their genomic data. It's so I think how we learn how to process all that information, and whether that leads to divisiveness, it certainly leads to kind of a sense of being overwhelmed, right?
Yeah, and I think that people in the midst of being confronted with all this information, they have to find ways to quickly organize it, which allows us to, well, rather prompts us to rely upon representations, that concept that I mentioned earlier, which get into these types of divisions and constructions and categorizations of people and groups, and the familiar versus what's not familiar. And so I can see how we're trying to play catch up in terms of our own development and keeping up with these new technologies, that we could revert back to some of these more comfortable tendencies that in the long run I think are very dangerous.
And I think spending time with the text is also like spending time with people.
Yeah.
What it means in the history of spirituality, that most of these texts, the Bible, the Quran, the Buddhist sutras, were never written down for several centuries, and people learned them by heart. And what it is right now, if you're a Tibetan monk, is you don't have a pile of books. You actually have memorized every one of these texts, and what it means to know something by heart, what it means to have gone through this text 700 times in one day, until you begin to, new meanings begin to reveal themselves. What it's also, rather than looking at somebody and guessing who they are in 1 second, what it means to spend quality time with someone and learn that all the things you thought someone was, of course they're none of those things, which is not just occasionally, that's all with everyone you meet. You're wrong about almost everything. And until you actually spend time with someone, for one thing, they're trying to convince you of something that they're not as well, so I'm not blaming one side. But what it takes to spend time to get to know who someone really is behind what all those appearances are. That's just time, investment of time and attention. And that quality of attention can move to how they're dressed and the Sherlock Holmes thing, to a deeper place, which is actually the Sufi place, where you're able to look and listen because you're so focused very deeply. One Sufi master who I toured with for several years of my life, a great Nubian oud player. We would be in some crowded restaurant in Los Angeles or Berlin, and he'd point to a table on the other side of the room, and he'd say, okay, Peter, what are they saying? And I would say, Hamza, this restaurant is so loud, everything's so crazy. And he said, you don't listen. You don't know how to listen. Focus on that table and tell me what they're saying.
That's eavesdropping. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, but it's also, in the Sufi thing, it's about healing. It's about actually knowing most human beings are trying to prevent you from understanding who they are. And you have to reach inside and be able to look in someone's eyes and see everything that's ever happened to them in a way that maybe they themselves don't even acknowledge or understand. And so some of that level of perception, anyway, thank you for this remark, because it really is about time, but of course time by itself isn't anything, because you can waste 10 years or use 5 minutes. You know, it's the quality of attention that's happening within that time. And again, that's one of the reasons theater was invented and portrait painting was invented, was so you would spend the time to look at someone, not just a glance, but actually look deeply. And that Rembrandt would go and sit with some old lady upstairs in the slums who no one would pay attention to, and Rembrandt spends 2 weeks with her and looks deeply into her eyes and paints her left sleeve. And then writes on the bottom, the biblical prophetess Esther, and sees in some old lady in a slum a biblical prophetess. And that quality of looking is really what we're talking about as artists, is looking past the surface into the layers of the lives.
Perfect. Back down to the front of the room, just so that we can move it around. Yes, right there.
Hi. I've always been curious about the correlation between memory and dreams, and the art of dreaming has always been very intriguing to me. What do you think shapes our dreams? Could it be our past memories telling us a story, as you said? Could it possibly be warnings for the future? Or is it something that we will simply never be able to understand?
That's great.
Well, I know what I think. I could be wrong.
Okay, science, please come to our rescue.
I mean, there is this part that there's, memory. You replay a lot of different things, and you put them together in all sorts of different ways in your memories. I mean, that's, and at least, in studies where you can look at animals that have, lived in an enriched environment, and you can look at how their brains are firing, and you watch them navigate through a maze, and you see all the parts of the circuits in their brain that are active. And then while they're asleep, you see the whole thing replayed again. So that may not be all that there is, but it kind of tells me, that's not how I look at my own memories. I look at them and my own dreams, I look at them and I go, boy, what did that mean?
Right.
But I also do think, wow, there must have been something that went on that I wasn't really paying attention to, but I knew was there, and I'm replaying it somehow, making it into a different story.
Yeah, I don't know what dreams mean. I certainly don't know what my dreams mean, but the point that I was trying to make with that particular quote, and it was a book that really talked about, a lot of it was based on neuroscience. I mean, the person who wrote the book, and I've kind of used the book, and it's been used in this way before, to talk about the importance of storytelling and how important it is to tell our stories and what our stories mean. And it was really the form that dreams take. I mean, dreams take the form of stories. I guess that's one way of thinking about it. Regardless of whether or not those stories are reenactments of the past or premonitions of the future or some weird mismatch of the two. It's really the story that's key, and that memory is sort of told through stories, basically. I mean, history, history, her story. I mean, we're talking about stories.
And also, genuinely, that we're not just forever in the damn past.
Right.
What it means to create a future is to actually be able to say, I have a dream. That is an incredibly powerful place to move forward from. And we all need every day to move forward. Yes, we're dragging all this stuff, but there's got to be some stuff that hasn't been done, hasn't been seen, is not already lived. And that's why we're on Earth, because some stuff hasn't happened yet.
Wonderful. I had a question. There
Hallelujah,
were questions up all the way up in the back there. Yes, right in the middle. If we can get a microphone up there. Do we have one? Oh, sorry, right here. Should we do this? Yeah. Perfect.
I wonder if you people could speak to what happens with traumatic situations that are in our memory when they're dealt with psychedelics.
You mean the traumatic? So there was a traumatic experience, and then there are psychedelics, or traumatic experience during psychedelic use?
No. No, all of the therapeutic things that are being done now, they're being reinstated now, where they're actually treating people to overcome their debilitating effects of trauma. So what's going on with that's a memory that gets changed?
I think it's, I do believe that it's a way of opening the doors of perception, that it's a way of increasing that plasticity in your brain so that you realize that if you have a traumatic experience that has led to a very strong sort of wiring so that everything reminds you, any little thing reminds you of that traumatic experience of, psychedelics will help rewire your brain in a way, and they will allow you to see things in a slightly different way. And again, I'm telling you that, but there's no honest evidence that that happens, except that it does allow individuals to experience their past experiences in a different way.
And maybe if I could just also add that, again, we just keep pathologizing trauma.
Yeah.
And not getting that trauma is also the key to your breakthrough. The key to the breakthroughs to the planet come out of trauma. And the deepest and most creative things come out of trauma and deep trauma. And I don't want to just keep insisting that trauma is a disaster and must be eliminated, surgically. But the opposite is, please go into the trauma and open it, and open it into a creative space. Open it into a deeply creative space, because you're not the only person carrying trauma. And actually, everybody needs to be able to deal with that. And so any possible creativity emerging from that is very powerful. And I would just say one of the greatest things about living in the United States of America is, it became the greatest country in the world because it was made by a lot of traumatized people. And the need to have a better idea, and the need to overcome, and the need to rise above, and the need to move forward and press on came from people escaping Holocausts or enduring them here. And that's the greatness of this country.
Right up there, in the back row right here.
I'll just shout.
Okay.
It's so near. Thank you. I'm curious about the influence or the effect of our senses on our memories. I notice, for example, that sometimes a smell can take you right back to another place in your life or another time, and I assume that memory is partially related to things that we see or things that we hear or taste. And I was curious if anybody had any thoughts about the role that our senses, as opposed to, where we stand in society, what gender we are, what race we are, how memory is affected by our senses.
Yeah, I mean, I opened up by talking about conventional social scientific ways of thinking about memory, and sensory memory was the very first one I had listed. And I think I gave the example of sight, and the way that if you're looking at a movie, you remember each frame and you see it as fluid motion when in fact it's actually individual frames. And so, yeah, I mean, the point you made earlier about smells, about sounds, I mean, all those things can trigger memories and you know, and be quite deep-seated. I mean, you would know more about the architecture of that in terms of how it works in the brain, but certainly we do look at those precursors to memories.
I mean, smell and taste have very profound effects on, on memory. And if any of you have ever eaten something and then gotten sick, that is one of the strongest ways of forming a memory, that you never want to eat that food again, or it takes an awful long time, and it gets back to that sort of very, I hate to use this word, but it's, you know, people talk about it as a primitive form of memory, and it is. You know, if you're a worm in the dirt and you eat something bitter that makes you really sick, you're not going to eat that again. And similar for smell. I mean, Proust, the Madeleine, it was, you know, brought back this incredible, deep, rich memory. And you know, I thought about it with the sounds that you were talking about, the voices, and certainly music. You know, music. You know, how many people, we were listening to songs about memory and making comments, but one of them really reminded me of being in high school, and it makes me, brings me back in a way that very little else will do that. You know?
And I would just also emphasize that we are so taught to value the part of the world that surrounds us made by men. And in fact, your grandmother's cooking shaped your life more than anything. You know, it's actually those smells, it's actually those tastes that are the deepest, deepest things shaping your life, because that's your grandmother and your mother shaping your life every single day during those crucial years. And so the smells and tastes go so deep, and go so deep into your earliest and most profound emotions. And I would also just emphasize the beauty of synesthesia, which is what we work with in the arts a lot, that there's a smell that you can associate with a sound, or a sound you associate with a taste, or a touch. We haven't talked that much about touch, but some of the artists that I work with work almost exclusively with touch. And the way in which your memory is connected to touch is very powerful, and the way a certain type of touch will trigger all kinds of feelings, all kinds of memories, all kinds of sensations. The thing that I love about those is, unlike sight, which has been, you know, organized by batteries of, you know, Republicans operatives who get up earlier than you do by 3 hours, and we've categorized a bunch of things, and we have labels on them, as you were saying. What's so beautiful about tastes and smells is they're so hard to label. They're so hard to reduce to, those are those kind of people, these are these kind of people, those are the good people, these are the bad people. It's really hard to organize taste that way. It's really difficult to put those same kind of egregious value judgments, whereas we're so trained to parse the visual world that way and look at people a certain way. But in fact, once you get into the taste, it moves in whole other directions that you're not in control of. So I'm very partial to those particular senses. Thank you.
Hi, I have a question. I was wondering, you guys have talked about like riots and anger and PTSD and trauma. And I was wondering, I'd love to hear you guys elaborate more on the process of healing. How do we pause and acknowledge, but also heal and move forward?
Well, I'm trying to think about that in the context of memory. Well, I mean, I think healing involves confronting trauma. I mean, on some very basic levels. I mean, I think any psychoanalyst would tell you that. Kind of engaging with the memories that kind of flow from the trauma allows you to bring it into the present and to analyze it in ways that subconsciously maybe you're not aware of. And it allows you to kind of, again, it must have some effect in the brain in terms of how you think about it from that point forward, and creates the conditions of possibility to kind of, you know, if it involves other groups, to engage with those groups that may have been off limits in the past. So I think on some very basic level, you have to acknowledge whatever it was that created the trauma, and then bring it into the present, analyze it, and then and talk about it, communicate. You know, share the stories that are associated with the trauma.
I mean, I agree. I think you have to attend to the trauma, and I do think that there is a really important part in, you know, for therapy, that there's another person there, that it's actually a social activity. It's not just on your own.
Right.
Thinking about it, confronting it, but it's acknowledging, and I think that's part of storytelling, is it really is a way of being able to tell your story to somebody, your narrative, and have it understood in a way that's accepted as a human experience, but not as one that is sort of fateful in a way that means that you're constrained by that fate. There certainly are, you know, for some things like PTSD, there are lots of very biological approaches to trying to increase the brain plasticity. There are a lot of people who try to do things like exposure therapy for a phobia. And I would say there it's really part of the important thing is that there's somebody else who's there, who's helping you relive that experience, but relive it in a different way, because it's not dangerous, it's not threatening in the reliving of it.
Absolutely, and not to be alone is the most important thing,
so.
because your trauma is all about being alone and not being able to deal with yourself, not being proud of yourself, in fact being ashamed, and to realize you're not the only person who's going through this. So what this means, that it's shared, and again, we're all so sure something's wrong with us, and we're not dealing with, there are systematic things going on that are affecting large numbers of people, and when you begin to realize you're not alone, it's a very, very deep thing. And I would just add, on behalf of the arts, that officially the Canadian government is now saying the only treatment that can actually be put forward at the moment for PTSD is music. And music is being used over and over again now for returning Canadian soldiers from Afghanistan and Iraq. And it's being very, very powerful results. And music has a way of both liberating and relaxing and opening and creating a spaciousness of thought and feeling. And at the same time, music can deal with very, very intense emotional states. And so music has had a profound effect on soldiers returning from these last wars.
One last question from the audience. Do we have a microphone? Here we are.
You were mentioning short-term memory and long-term memory before. And so why, when we are very old and at the end, near the end of our life, we remember only things a long time ago, and we don't want to deny things that are present. I don't know, you call it short-term memory. It's only a long-term memory. So it's very strange, because I'm thinking about the brain that is corroding, that is getting old, and actually you should remember the last things you just did, not the things before, because it's gone. And instead, when you hear the last word of people that are almost dying, they tell you things from the past, from when they were young. They remember the mother. They tell you stories that are really back, and that strike me. So I would like to know, as a scientist, what's happening to our brain.
Well, I'm going to, Kelsey, this is your area of specialty. So, I mean, is it true that it's all in there? It's just a matter of how we access it? Is that what it really is? Or, I mean, how do these things work?
Well, I mean, so I'll be
It's a good last question.
I'll be
Here,
perfectly honest that not only do I not know how they really work, but nobody knows how they really work. But I can tell you what some hypotheses are, which is that when I talked about this brain plasticity and about the ability of forming different synapses, that's really good in young people. It's not so good as you get older. Right. And so you really have created these circuits that are pretty hardwired. And so you can remember, things from a long time ago, but it's harder to have that plasticity that's going to encode new memories. So that's one of the things that, to me, that it's exactly what I work on in my own lab, is trying to understand what at a molecular level is happening that allows us to go from a short-term to a long-term memory. And what's that kind of plasticity? Because, it's both, there's that wonderful thing about being a child that you can learn new languages, you can learn how to play the violin much more easily than when you're older. And there is that kind of a little bit of a shrinking down of that plasticity. It's not all or none, and we see people all over who continue, and there are all these things that show that if you listen to music, if you dance, if you do crosswords, if you do, you read, that you keep that going. But I do think it's it's something that happens with aging. You lose some of that brain plasticity, and so you have all the old-term memories because they're already stored. Right. You just don't have that ability to change the circuit.
And I think also the encounter, what we always remember is our first encounter with something, or our first encounter with someone. And so it's when everything's new that we actually remember it, and our experience of discovery is so profound. And once you stop discovering, once something isn't new, it's hard to create a new memory, because you're actually repeating what, forgive me for saying this, but my mother, who's really forgetting a lot these days, is in a place where people are helping to care for her, and they have a trip in a bus in the afternoons to go out to the beach in San Francisco and see the Golden Gate. And my mother said to me 2 days ago, "I've seen the water, I've seen the beach, I don't need to see those things." And it's very intense, because what is it when you tell yourself it's not a new experience? You stop creating new experience.
Thank you. Everybody, we're going to have to draw the evening to a close here. I don't think it would be too self-aware to say for everybody in the room, thank you for an incredibly memorable evening. I think everyone in the audience, please help me thank our three guests for taking time out of their very busy lives. UCLA's Dean of the David Geffen School of Medicine, Kelsey Martin, UCLA's Dean for the Division of Social Sciences, World Arts and Cultures Professor Peter Sellars, and the memory of World Arts Cultures Professor Polly Neuter Roberts, who is with us here also this evening. Thank you, everybody.